All right, here we are at 4.5c. Again, chapter 4 is systems of equations. Section 4.5 includes linear inequalities, and this is example 3. We're going to graph actually the inequalities here, a system of inequalities, and there we'll have to pay attention to shading and number 1, graph the lines. Number 2, decide where the shading goes for each line, and then where the shading overlaps, essentially that's where our system of inequalities, that's where the solution is of the system of inequalities. So here's again linear inequalities and systems of inequalities. Here is kind of an idea about what I just talked about. Graph the line, then decide which side of the line should be shaded. Green means we're going to have a solid line because it includes an equal sign. Red means because there's no equal sign in our inequalities that we have got a dotted line. And then decide which side of the line should be shaded. We use 0, 0 as a test point, kind of make it easy. All right, so let's go down to here and kind of pause here and say, well, if we've got a system of inequalities, if we've got a system of equations, we've got either a point or a line, or there's no solution because they're parallel. That's a system of linear equations. In a system of linear inequalities, so here's our linear inequalities that we're talking about in this chapter, the solution is where the shading overlaps. So there's always going to be some shading, where the shading overlaps. So we've got to take a look at both inequalities, find the shading, and then find out where they overlap. So let's go down here and work on this one. I'm going to say this is going to be my red line. So there's my red line, x minus 3y greater than or equal to 3. So we've got an equal sign, so we use a solid line. So for this one, we can't really graph it yet, but what we can do is modify it and say, well, I've got x minus 3y greater than or equal to 3. I've got to put it into y equals mx plus b format, so subtract the x, and I've got negative 3y greater than or equal to negative x plus 3. And now I've got to divide by negative 3 and divide by negative 3. And on the left side, I've got y. On the right side, I've got negative 1x divided by negative 3 gives me a positive 1/3. Negative divided by negative is positive, and I've got 1 over 3. There's an invisible 1 there, and that's my x term. Plus divided by minus, or positive divided by negative, is a negative. 3 divided by 3 is 1. And here, the reason I didn't put anything in here, just to remind you that if we divide by a negative number, we have to flip the direction of the inequality. So instead of being greater than or equal to, it's less than or equal to. So there's our red line that we're graphing. So slope m equals 1/3 equals negative 1 over 3 equals my rise over my run. All right, my b is equal to negative 1. My y-intercept happens when x equals 0, and b is negative 1. So there's our test point. Sorry, that's not our test point. That's our y-intercept. So we're going to graph the red line. Here's my red line. Had to modify it, put it into y equals mx plus b format, or y inequality mx plus b format, and we pulled out the slope. We pulled out the b and the y-intercept. Not really pretty there. Here's red. Y-intercept. So let's graph. We start with graphing the y-intercept, 0, negative 1. 0 in the x direction, negative 1 in the y. And there's our y-intercept. Use our slope of rise over run to get the next point. Rise of 1, run of 3. 1, 2, 3. Rise. Also, rise of negative 1 over, should be negative 3. Rise of negative 1 over negative 3. And there's our next point, because negative divided by negative is a positive, and that's what we have here for a slope. All right, so there's our 3 points. We make a line. That 3 points can make a line. 2 can make a line. 1's a double check. And now we say, well, let's see. I've got an equal sign, so I do include the line. So I make a solid line as best I can, drawing freehand. And there's my red line. That's my red line. And now I have to look at the inequality. I'd use a test point of 0, 0. And say, all right, well, I can go up here and say, you know what? If x is 0, that term goes away. If y is 0, that term goes away. And basically, the left side becomes 0. Is 0 greater than or equal to 3? It's not. 0 is not greater than 3. So this point doesn't make sense in our inequality. So we just shade the other side. And here's where I recommend using arrows, because when we're going to have a system of equations, we're going to say it's going to get a little messy, or messier, let's say. All right, let's use Christmas colors and say, you know what? Let's figure out what else we've got. Let's see. So here's my green line. Oops, I'm gonna bring green. Sorry. This is my green line here that I'm going to graph. It's already in y equals mx plus b format. And I shouldn't say equals, but it's in slope-intercept form with an inequality. So here's my green line, and I can pull out the slope m equals -2 equals -2 over 1 equals 2 over -1 equals my rise over my run. And that will give me a run. And yes, it is misspelled. Sorry. Down here too. B equals 4. So then my y-intercept happens when x equals 0, and our b is 4. So we start graphing this by looking for the y-intercept. 0 in the x direction, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the y direction. There's our first point. We use our slope to get another one. A slope of -2 means our slope is going to be going like this. Our line is going to be going something like this. Forward in the x direction, down in the y direction. So sure enough, slope of -2 means my rise of -2 over and run of 1, or rise of 2, run of -1, rise of 2, run of -1. There's 3 points that are collinear, and sure enough, they would make a line, and I've got to determine, do I use a solid line or a dashed line? This inequality does not include an equal sign, so we would use a dashed line here. There's my dashed line as best I can make it. Alright, so there's my dashed line, something like that. Now I've got to use that same test point, and I'll use that same test point of 0, 0 to say, does it make sense? Does 0, 0 make sense in my inequality? So I'm going to say, let's see here. I'll go over here and say y. I'm going to rewrite my inequality. Y is greater than -2x plus 4. And substitute in y equals 0, because that's my test point, greater than, with a question mark on top of it, -2 times x. X is 0, so 0 plus 4. Is 0 greater than 4? 0 is not greater than 4, so our shading goes over here on this side. So our green line is a dashed line. Our test point wasn't included in the solution, so our shading should be over here. So our shading now can be, we can fill in this side over here and say, you know what, there's my shading that makes sense. And now it makes it a lot clearer to see, here's an arrow and here's an arrow. Red arrows go this way, green arrows go this way, so my overlap would be right over here. So there's our solution for a system of linear inequalities.